The evening rain was falling so heavily that the street looked like it was wrapped in a silver curtain. Neon lights from the shops blurred into long streaks on the wet pavement. And most people hurried past with their umbrellas, trying to escape the cold night. But in the middle of that empty sidewalk, a young black woman didn't seem to care about the rain at all. She held onto an old shopping cart filled with blankets and small bags, gently pushing it beside an elderly woman with silver white hair. The old lady walked slowly, her steps unsteady, her coat damp from the weather. But her smile was warm. She looked up at the young woman with the kind of gratitude that didn't need words. The young woman reached out and held the old lady's hand with both care and familiarity. As if this wasn't the first night they had walked together like this. It was clear she wasn't helping out of pity, she was helping because she truly cared. They shared a quiet laugh about the rain, and the old lady squeezed the young woman's hand lightly. Even in the middle of a dark, rainy street, there was a kind of softness around them, like they carried their own light. For a moment, they looked like two people who had known each other for a long time, even though their lives had only recently crossed paths. But just a few feet away, hidden beside the brick wall of a closed building, a man was watching them. He was soaked from head to toe, his clothes torn and stained, his hair dripping rainwater onto his face. His breathing was unsteady, and his eyes followed every movement of the two women with a mix of fear, longing, and something deeper, something he didn't want anyone to see. He pressed himself closer to the wall as if trying to disappear into the shadows. It was clear he didn't want them to notice him. His hands were trembling, and the cold wasn't the only reason. The way he looked at the old lady wasn't the look of a stranger. It was the look of someone who recognized her, someone who knew her from a life he no longer belonged to. When the young woman leaned down to cover the old lady's shoulders with a blanket from the cart, the man's expression softened for a split second. But the moment didn't last long. A car passed by, splashing water near him, and he flinched, tightening his jaw as if trying to control the storm raging inside him. The two women continued walking slowly down the street, unaware of the man hiding just a few steps behind them. Their laughter blended with the sound of the rain, while the man stayed frozen in the shadows, wrestling with a truth he had kept buried for far too long, a truth that, sooner or later, would no longer stay hidden. Tonight, everything looked calm on the surface, but this quiet walk in the rain was the beginning of something much bigger. A choice, a secret, and a past that was about to return. The two women continued walking slowly through the rainy street, their silhouettes becoming smaller as they moved farther away. The young woman kept her hand on the old lady's arm, steadying her with gentle patience. Their soft voices faded under the sound of the rain, but the man who had been hiding beside the brick wall didn't follow them. Instead, he took a shaky step backward into the narrow alley behind him, as if retreating from a memory that was too heavy to carry into the open street. The alley was colder than the sidewalk, and the dim light couldn't reach the far end. Water dripped from a broken pipe, landing rhythmically into a puddle near his feet. The man wiped the rain from his face with the sleeve of his torn jacket. But he couldn't wipe away the turmoil in his eyes. He looked toward the direction where the two women had disappeared, his breath uneven, his hands tightening into fists and then loosening again, unsure of what to do next. A distant rumble grew louder as a police car drove past the entrance of the alley. The flashing red and blue lights cut across his face for a brief moment, revealing more of his exhaustion, his fear, and the guilt etched deep into his expression. He turned his face away quickly, pressing himself against the wall as if hoping the bricks could swallow him whole. It was almost instinctive, like someone who had spent years hiding, avoiding attention, and staying out of sight. Even with the police car gone, he didn't move for a long moment. His body stayed tense, as though he was frozen between the urge to run and the urge to step out of the shadows. The sound of the rain filled the silence as he lowered his head, feeling the weight of something much heavier than the soaked clothes on his body. He knew the old lady wasn't just another person passing by on the street. He knew exactly who she was and why seeing her tore open the wound he had tried so hard to bury. But he still couldn't bring himself to approach her. Not after everything that had happened. Not yet. He took another slow step deeper into the alley, letting the darkness wrap around him again. Whatever he was running from, or running toward, he wasn't ready to face it. Not tonight. But the way he looked back one last time showed that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a truth he could no longer avoid. The rain finally softened as the young woman and the elderly lady reached the small soup kitchen at the corner of the street. Warm light spilled out from the doorway, cutting through the cold night around them. The young woman brushed raindrops from the old lady's shoulders before helping her step inside, where the air was thick with the smell of hot soup and fresh bread. For the first time that evening, the old lady's shivering eased a little. They found an empty table near the back. The young woman gently pulled out a chair, and the old lady sat down with a grateful sigh. A volunteer brought them 2 bowls of soup, steam rising in soft curls. The old lady wrapped her frail fingers around the bowl, letting the warmth settle into her palms. She looked at the young woman with a quiet smile, one that held more trust than words could express. While they ate, the old lady began speaking in a low voice, sharing small pieces of her day, the long walks, the cold mornings, and the feeling of being lost in a city that never slowed down. The young woman listened with steady attention, nodding gently, offering comfort without interrupting. Their bond grew quietly, built on patience and presence rather than dramatic moments. But outside the window, a familiar figure lingered in the shadows. The man had followed them from a distance, not close enough to be seen, but never far enough to lose sight of them. He stood beneath a broken streetlight, his soaked clothes clinging to him, his breathing shallow from the cold. Through the glass, he could see the old lady sitting safely inside, her hands finally warmed, her face no longer burdened by fear or loneliness. Something in his expression shifted. The tightness in his jaw eased for a moment, replaced by an ache of longing that he could not hide, even from himself. It was the look of someone who wanted to step forward but felt chained by his own past. His fingers gripped the edge of his sleeve as if trying to steady the storm inside him. Inside the soup kitchen, the old lady reached across the table and touched the young woman's hand, whispering a soft, "Thank you." Outside, the man took one slow step back into the dimness. The distance between them wasn't just physical, it was a distance built over years, shaped by regret, mistakes, and a truth he still wasn't brave enough to confront. But even as he disappeared from the window's edge, he kept his eyes fixed on the place where the old lady sat, as if silently promising himself that this wouldn't be the last time he watched over her. When the rain began coming down harder again, the young woman gently placed her hand on the old lady's back and helped her stand up from the table. The warmth from the soup kitchen had eased the cold in the old lady's body. But the night was still long, and the young woman didn't want her wandering the streets any longer. She guided the old lady toward the exit, making sure her scarf was wrapped securely before stepping into the damp air outside. They walked slowly through the quiet streets until they reached a small apartment building tucked behind a row of stores. The entrance wasn't grand, but it was clean, and the hallway smelled faintly of detergent and warm laundry. The young woman unlocked her door and nudged it open, letting the soft golden light spill into the hallway. Inside, the apartment was modest, a small living room with a faded couch, a tiny kitchenette, and a single lamp glowing beside a stack of books. But compared to the cold sidewalks and alleys the old lady had grown used to, it felt like stepping into another world. The warmth in the room wrapped around her immediately, making her exhale with a kind of relief she hadn't felt in years. The young woman handed her a dry towel and guided her to sit on the couch. The old lady placed her trembling hands on the blanket covering the cushions, brushing the fabric with slow, thoughtful movements, as if reminding herself that this softness was real. The young woman moved around the room, gathering spare clothes and a cup of warm tea. Every action she took showed the same quiet care she had shown all evening. But outside, on the sidewalk just beyond the apartment building, the man stood again. He hovered under the awning, trying to shield himself from the rain, though his clothes were already soaked. He watched the lights turning on in the young woman's apartment and saw the shadow of the old lady moving inside. There was something in the way he stared, something heavy, almost painful. He lifted a hand slightly, then dropped it, unsure whether he had the right to step any closer than this. From inside, the old lady glanced toward the window as if sensing something. Her expression changed for a brief moment, something between recognition and uncertainty, before she turned back to the young woman and managed a small smile. The night continued quietly. The old lady settled into the couch. Warm at last. While outside, the man stayed rooted to the same spot, caught between wanting to protect her and being terrified of what would happen if he showed himself. The old lady woke up to the soft sound of morning traffic drifting through the apartment window. For a moment, she lay still, trying to understand where she was. The blanket beneath her felt clean and warm, and the faint smell of breakfast from the small kitchen told her she wasn't outside anymore. When she slowly sat up, she noticed the young woman moving quietly around the room, preparing a simple meal. The young woman greeted her with a gentle smile and asked if she had slept well. The old lady nodded, though her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the blanket around her shoulders. She seemed touched that someone had made space for her, even just for one night. The warmth of the apartment contrasted sharply with the countless cold mornings she had started on park benches or street corners. As the young woman handed her a glass of warm water, the old lady insisted on helping with something. She tried to stand and reach for a cup on the kitchen counter. But her fingers slipped, and the cup fell from her hand. It hit the floor and rolled without breaking. But the old lady's face tightened in embarrassment. She murmured an apology, shaking her head as if reminding herself of her own fragility. The young woman quickly reassured her, picking up the cup and telling her it was completely fine. Her calm tone eased the old lady's worry, and the tension in the old woman's shoulders slowly softened again. The two shared a small moment of understanding, one offering care, the other learning how to receive it. Outside the apartment building, the man from the night before sat on the concrete step, his back leaning against the metal railing. His clothes, still damp from the rain, clung to him uncomfortably, but he didn't seem to notice. He kept his eyes fixed on the door of the apartment, watching the morning light spill through the window above. His expression was tired but alert, as if waiting for something he wasn't sure he deserved. He rubbed his hands together, trying to warm them, though there was more worry than cold in his movements. Every now and then, he glanced down the street, as if thinking he should leave before anyone noticed him. But each time he nearly stood up, he stopped himself and remained where he was. Inside, the young woman placed a small plate of food on the table and invited the old lady to join her. The old lady hesitated only for a moment before smiling softly and taking her seat. And just outside, the man remained seated, close enough to watch over her, but still too far away to be part of her morning. By late afternoon, the rain had shifted into a light drizzle, just enough to dampen the air without driving people indoors. The young woman suggested they take a short walk to the nearby park, hoping the fresh air would help the old lady feel more relaxed after a long, emotional night. The old lady agreed, leaning on her arm as they made their way down the sidewalk. The park was quiet, with only a few people passing through. Water clung to the leaves, and the ground glistened softly beneath the dim gray sky. The young woman guided the old lady to a wooden bench that faced a small pond. The old lady sat down carefully, adjusting her scarf against the cool breeze. After a moment of silence, she began speaking, slowly at first, then with growing clarity. She told the young woman about her earlier years, the places she had lived, the family she once had, and the mistakes she believed had pushed people away. Her voice cracked at times, not from weakness but from the weight of memories she rarely shared. The young woman listened with patience, giving her the space to speak without judgment. As the old lady talked, she wiped away a tear that had formed in the corner of her eye. She admitted that the hardest part of growing old wasn't the physical discomfort, but the feeling that she no longer belonged anywhere. She lowered her head, trying to hide her emotions, but the young woman gently squeezed her hand, letting her know she didn't have to hold everything in. Across the park, partially hidden behind a cluster of trees, the man watched them. His posture was tense, as though torn between stepping forward and disappearing altogether. He held something in his hand, a worn photograph. Edges frayed and colors faded. He stared at the picture, then back at the old lady on the bench. His eyes filled with an ache he couldn't fully express. His breathing grew uneven as he listened to her faint voice drifting across the park. Every word seemed to pull him backward into a past he had spent years trying to outrun. He pressed the photograph to his chest, gripping it tightly as though it were the only thing keeping him anchored. The old lady eventually grew quiet, taking a deep breath as she looked at the pond. She didn't know someone was watching her with more longing and regret than she could imagine. The young woman helped her stand, and together they began walking slowly toward the exit of the park. The man remained behind the trees, watching them leave with the same mixture of fear and hope that had followed him since the night before. Though he didn't move closer, it was clear he wasn't ready to walk away either. As evening settled in, the temperature dropped again, pushing a thin mist across the sidewalks. On their way home from the park, the young woman suggested stopping by a small convenience store to buy a few essentials, tea, bread, and medicine the old lady occasionally needed. The bright sign above the store flickered softly, standing out against the darkening sky. The young woman guided the old lady to the entrance and asked her to wait just outside while she grabbed the items quickly. The old lady nodded, leaning slightly on her cane as she settled near the wall beside the door. She watched people pass by, strangers wrapped in coats, moving through their own routines, unaware of the weight she carried in her thoughts. But then, as she shifted her gaze toward the sidewalk, she froze. Just a few steps away stood the same man who had been watching from afar, though she didn't know that. His clothes were still worn, his face tired, his hair messy from days of rain and cold. He had been walking on the opposite side of the street when he suddenly stopped, as if the sight of her had pulled him back in time. For a moment, neither of them moved. The old lady's eyes widened, and her breath caught in her throat. There was something unmistakably familiar about him, something in the shape of his face, the way his shoulders slumped, the sadness in his expression. She clutched her scarf with trembling fingers, whispering a name so softly even she wasn't sure if she had spoken aloud. The man's reaction was immediate. His posture stiffened, and he quickly looked away, like someone trying to escape recognition. But his feet refused to move. He stood rooted to the spot, torn between wanting to run and wanting to step closer. His hands shook slightly, and the worn photograph in his pocket seemed almost too heavy to carry. The old lady took a small step forward, her voice unsure, fragile, and filled with a trembling fear she couldn't explain. You look like someone I used to know." The man swallowed hard, avoiding her eyes. The silence stretched painfully between them, thick with things neither was ready to say. Inside the store, the young woman finished paying for the groceries. She reached the door just as she noticed the strange tension between the old lady and the man standing near her. She quickened her pace, her instinct immediately rising. The old lady didn't turn to greet her. She stood frozen, staring at the man as though she had seen a ghost. And the man, unable to hide any longer, finally lifted his eyes to meet hers, a look filled with guilt, sorrow, and a connection that went far deeper than the young woman could have imagined. The young woman stepped outside the store, carrying the small bag of groceries, but she immediately sensed something was wrong. The old lady wasn't looking at her. She was staring directly at the man who stood only a few steps away. As if the rest of the world had faded out, the air between them felt strangely heavy, filled with recognition neither of them fully understood yet. The old lady's voice shook as she tried to speak again. I've seen you before, haven't I?" Her tone wasn't accusing, not even fearful, just confused and fragile. Like someone touching a memory that had been buried too deep. The man swallowed hard, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. He didn't answer. He merely stood there in the dim light, raindrops clinging to his hair and clothes, his hands tightening inside his sleeves. His eyes darted between her face and the ground, as if he couldn't bear to meet her gaze for too long. The young woman stepped forward protectively, placing a hand on the old lady's arm. "Ma'am, do you know him?" she asked gently. The old lady didn't respond right away. Her trembling fingers moved to her mouth, and she blinked rapidly, as though fighting back a sudden wave of emotion. I don't know, but something about him." Her voice cracked, and she touched her chest as if trying to calm her racing heartbeat. When she finally looked at the man again, her eyes softened, not with fear, but with a quiet ache she couldn't explain. The man's lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. Years of guilt seemed to hold him back. After a long silence, he finally forced himself to lift his head. His voice, when it came, was barely more than a whisper. "I never meant for things to turn out this way." The young woman's eyes narrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" she asked, stepping a little closer. But the old lady reacted differently. She gasped softly, as if a puzzle piece had just clicked into place inside her mind. Her knees weakened, and the young woman quickly steadied her. Rain began falling a little harder, pattering against the sidewalk around them. The man didn't move. He stood there with a look that held too many emotions at once: shame, longing, fear, and something deeper that none of them were ready to name. The young woman looked between them, sensing a history she didn't know yet but couldn't ignore. "Do you know him?" she repeated. This time the old lady answered, but only with a whisper drowned partly by the rain. I think he's someone I lost." The man closed his eyes at her words, as though they struck directly at a wound he had carried for years. Whatever connected them wasn't just coincidence, and whatever truth he had been hiding was no longer something he could escape. The old lady's whisper hung in the air, fragile and trembling. The young woman tightened her grip on the old lady's arm, steadying her as the rain continued falling around them. The man stayed frozen in place, his eyes lowered, his shoulders sagging under the weight of something he had carried far too long. The young woman finally broke the tense silence. "What does she mean? Lost how? Do you know her?" Her voice wasn't harsh, but protective, firm enough to demand the truth. The man took a long breath, his chest rising and falling unevenly. When he finally lifted his head, his eyes were clouded with exhaustion and regret. "I knew her," he said quietly, "long before all of this." The old lady blinked, tears forming in her eyes even though she still didn't fully understand why. "Who are you?" she whispered. He hesitated. The answer sat on the edge of his tongue, trembling like it was afraid to be spoken. "My name is Daniel," he finally said, "and I'm your son." The young woman gasped softly, but the old lady simply stared, stunned into silence. Her fingers pressed against her lips as she tried to process the words. "No, that can't be," she murmured, shaking her head slowly. "My son, he left years ago. He never came back. He disappeared." Daniel swallowed hard, unable to hide the pain in his expression. "I did," he admitted. "I walked away. I was angry, stubborn, and I ran from everything, including you." His voice cracked under the weight of the confession. "And when I finally wanted to come back, I didn't know how." The old lady's tears slipped down her cheeks. Her body trembled, not from fear, but from the shock of a truth she had long buried under loneliness. "Why didn't you say something earlier?" she asked in a shaking voice. "Why did you hide from me?" Daniel looked down, ashamed. "Because I didn't deserve to face you. I wasn't the son you remembered. I wasn't the man I wanted to be. Every time I tried to approach you, I froze." He exhaled shakily. "And then I saw you with her," he said, glancing at the young woman. "You looked safe, cared for, happier than I ever made you." The old lady covered her face with her hands. The young woman placed a gentle hand on her back, letting her lean into her for support. Daniel stepped back a little, as if giving them space. "I never meant to hurt you," he said softly. "I just didn't know how to fix what I'd broken." The old lady lowered her hands, her eyes red but no longer confused. "Daniel," she whispered, the name trembling on her lips like something both painful and precious. For the first time in years, mother and son stood face to face, not healed yet, but no longer separated by silence. 1 year passed quietly after the night Daniel revealed the truth. It wasn't an easy year, but it was a healing one. Daniel slowly began rebuilding his life, finding shelter, taking small jobs, and keeping his promise to change. He never pushed himself into the old lady's life. Instead, he showed up with consistency, humility, and a wish to be better than the man he once was. The old lady lived peacefully with the young woman, who continued caring for her with the same kindness she had shown from the beginning. Their small apartment became a place of comfort, where mornings were no longer cold and lonely. The old lady grew stronger, not just in body but in spirit, knowing she finally had someone who truly saw her and valued her. Daniel visited often, sometimes for dinner, sometimes just to talk. Every visit was cautious, gentle, and filled with unspoken hope. The old lady forgave him slowly, not because the past didn't hurt, but because she saw the sincerity in the way he tried to make amends. And the young woman, who had unknowingly become the bridge between them, supported both without judgment. Then, one afternoon, as sunlight filtered softly through the apartment window, the old lady called the young woman to sit beside her. Her voice was calm, steady in a way that carried years of wisdom. "I want you to know something," she began. "Before I met you, I had nothing, or at least I believed I had nothing left. But this past year, you gave me a home. You gave me kindness when you owed me nothing. You gave me a life I thought I'd lost forever." The young woman held her hand, unsure what the old lady was trying to say. The old lady continued, her eyes shining with quiet resolve. "I made arrangements," she said gently. "Everything I own, my savings, the small property I still have, the little I've managed to hold on to, it will all be yours." The young woman froze, stunned. "But, why me?" she whispered. The old lady smiled softly. "Because you loved me when you didn't know who I was. You cared for me without expecting anything in return. You gave me dignity. You gave me family." Daniel, who had been sitting nearby, lowered his head. He wasn't surprised. In fact, he looked almost relieved, not because he didn't care, but because he understood. The old lady reached for his hand as well. "And you, Daniel, you're my son. My blood. Nothing will ever change that. But this young woman saved me. She saved both of us in her own way." Tears filled Daniel's eyes, but he nodded slowly, accepting the decision with gratitude rather than resentment. In that small living room, the three of them sat together, no longer broken pieces scattered by time, but a strange, unexpected family formed by compassion, forgiveness, and second chances. And so the story ended not with loss, but with a home rebuilt, a bond restored, and a future none of them had imagined when their paths first crossed on a rainy night.